clearly are dangers, potential dangers, especially for people that get into it naively and don't really understand what is involved. And that can happen through something as simple as a newspaper horoscope. A few hits and misses here and there, and there's a greater interest in astrology developed. They go to a professional astrologer who tells them things about themselves that no one could really know. Trust is generated, and then there's a logical progression. Once the clients are amazed by the self-disclosures, they generate trust. Trust leads to deception. Deception produces unwise or immoral decisions and actions, and these produce tragedy. Now let me show you some examples of why this is true. One astrologer predicted that a child would be born mentally retarded. And as a result, an individual, the mother, decided to have an abortion. Another advised a client against his child's appendectomy. The child died as a result. One mother murdered her own son because the astrologer said that he would live a life of mental illness, and she killed him to spare him this difficulty. A leading theologian who has studied the occult his entire life, Dr. Kurt Koch, stated that, quote, astrology has been responsible for a number of suicides and murders. To give you two illustrations, one astrologer told a client that she would not marry the man she was engaged to, that they would break up and that she would remain single. Well, she was deeply in love with this man, and she became more and more depressed and morose, and finally became suicidal and resolved to take her own life. And it was only through the power of Christ intervening that prevented that woman from taking her own life. In another case, an individual was told by his astrologer that his second wife would be the one that would make him truly happy, and his first wife would not. Well, he had to marry first in order to find a second wife. His first wife bore him 3 wonderful children. They had a happy marriage, but after their third child, he divorced his first wife and then married the one he thought and was promised by the astrologer would truly fulfill him and make him happy. She made his life miserable, and he divorced her. 6 lives at that point were in some sense, to some degree, ruined. And the problem with astrology is that decisions are made on the basis of the alleged influence of the stars or the planets as interpreted by an astrologer and often a spirit guide, a deceptive spirit being, that have no basis in reality. Once you have the entrance of spiritistic deception into the interpretation of a chart, you can encounter all kinds of potential problems and tragedies. So I think there is a potential danger for people who get involved in astrology.
Maxine, this brings up the whole issue of when you're actually giving counsel to people that trust you.
Yes, John.
Do you ever worry about the counsel that you're giving them?
I think very deeply about the counsel I give them, and I pray about it beforehand. I think the astrologer has an incredible responsibility. And the counsel that I give my clients, now I can only speak for me. The counsel I give my clients is I never tell somebody to do something or not do something. That's up to them. What I do is I read what I see. I do encourage them to ask me questions, and very often they will ask you, what would you do in my place? And my answer is, what I would do in your place is not what you would do in your place. So that the astrologer is simply reading the signs for the client. You do not tell a client, do this or do that. And I really cannot imagine how anybody, and now this is my personal opinion, I can't imagine how anybody could predict that a child would be mentally deficient. I don't know how, because I've studied astrology for 22 years. I've been a practicing astrologer for 18. I don't know how they do that. That's not to say that they can't, but I've not that ability. When I read somebody's chart, if I were to read your chart, if you ask me what I would do doesn't matter. It's what you choose to do. And the whole point of doing the chart is so that you don't become dependent on it. You don't want to become dependent on an astrologer.
My experience, though, has been that most people do become dependent on an astrologer because they vest in the astrologer almost a godlike authority.
Have you had any,
these people are, supposedly can predict the future to some degree, and about 80% of those that I talked to said that in general and specific instances, an astrologer is capable of predicting the future. What are the reasons people go to an astrologer for? The major questions in life: health, finances, will my spouse die? What about investments? What about relationships? Very key issues. and therefore the answers that are given, you open up Pandora's box for potential misuse.
Well, those are key issues, but I think we have to realize that only about half of what astrology does is actually prediction, and that's a common misunderstanding about astrology. There is another part where you talk about character analysis and so forth, and personality characteristics in very much the same way a psychologist does. And I think that certainly we could say that the obvious misuse of astrology is pointed out in these cases.
Okay.
That similar misuses have occurred in psychology.
Two questions I have
areas.
for you here, Terry. One is, maybe you're familiar with Richard Knoll. He's got an AFA insignia on his book,
Yes, I know
Interpreting
him.
Astrology, and he's got one about the techniques of astrology. In there, he made an astounding statement to me. He was, first of all, taking apart astrology before he put it back together. And he said that astrologers, now correct me, and I want some figures here. He says other astrologers, 50–60% of them are frauds. Okay? 50 to 60% of them are frauds. Now, in what way are they frauds, and what can we do about that?
Well, of course, again, as I think as Maxine has said over here, I'm not sure what he had in mind. I'd have to have him here to ask him. My own particular belief wouldn't be that 50 or 60% of them are intentionally fraudulent.
That's the point that he makes.
Yeah,
They're
I
not
think that-
intentional, but they
right.
are fraud. For example, we were talking about the fact that we didn't like the idea of all these newspaper astrologers. Okay, well,
Right.
that's a bundle right there.
First of all, it all depends on how much knowledge you have to have before you are permitted to call yourself an astrologer. I think we remember very well in the newspaper case where a very attractive young blonde lady applied to a particular newspaper syndicate, and within no time at all she was syndicated nationally with the sun sign column. She got rather I don't know, bold and admitted sometime later that she'd only studied astrology 3 weeks before they syndicated her. I've known cases of friends of mine that have been approached by major magazines in the country and asked to write a sun sign astrology column. And when my friend said, "But I don't know anything of astrology," they said, "Oh, it doesn't matter anyway. You just write anything."
Doesn't that scare you?
It does scare me.
How many of those people do you think are out there?
Oh, it'd be very, very difficult to estimate. I can only guess. I would say that, you know, I have a particular theory that amongst doctors, probably only medical doctors, probably only about 10% of them are really very good at what they do, and I think we could say the same for attorneys and auto mechanics. And I think we have to assume that that's probably true about every discipline. I'm not saying that 90% of them are unethical, but when you take on in the unethical, the incompetent, and the snake oil salesman and all this, you put it all together, I think in almost any field, you know, you're going to find that probably only about 10% of them actually end up being very good at what they say they can do.
I got to take a break. Llewellyn, you got a
Yeah,
final
I would
comment?
really disagree with that. I think most of your MDs are responsible and ethical. Maybe only a few percent are frauds. But John Townley, he's a respected U.S. astrologer with 20 years experience. He says this, quote, I would say that most of the accusers of astrology are probably correct. They think that astrologers are 100% charlatans, but I would bring it down to 90%. In other words, he's saying 90% of astrologers are charlatans. Your chance of getting a charlatan are 9 out of 10.
Yes, I'd like to ask you two how you explain the diversity of personalities and destinies among twins.
Yeah.
It's a very good question. Do you want me to take it?
Well, go ahead and I'll finish.
Okay. Well, I assume, of course, you're probably speaking of identical twins in this
Right.
particular case. We do know that in the case of very close identical twins that there are often amazingly close